Hi, I'm Lacey Bankhead with Cultivate Biblical Studies, and this week we're going to be going over week 8 of the Exodus Part 1 study. We're going to be going back and forth between page 71 and 79 in your workbook, so go ahead and get that ready so we can get started. Pause here and go ahead and read out loud or listen to, or just read silently if that's all you can do, Exodus 13 and 14 in the ESV translation if you have it. And then we'll meet back here in just a few minutes and we'll get started on this lesson. So we're going to be starting on page 71, and I want you to look at the first 16 verses. That encompasses on page 71 and 72. That is basically a review to us on the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. It's God going into, and the Bible going into, more detail on what this feast will be. This feast takes place on the 7th day of Passover. Passover is a 7-day event, and on the 7th and last day, they have the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. I want you to think of these words as kind of interchangeable. If you see Feast of the Unleavened Bread, it's talking about the remembrance of Passover. When you see the word Passover, or we talk about it in this study, we're actually talking about the event that happened in Egypt. But the words are interchangeable because like the Jews right now celebrate Passover when this spring comes in 2021, and what that means is they're going to be celebrating the remembrance of the entire Passover, and the last feast on the 7th day will be the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. But I want you to understand that the terms are sort of interchangeable, so you don't get confused and think that they're talking about two separate things. One has to do with the other. So even though it's mostly the same information that we saw in the last chapter, there's a little bit of new information and new things that are being introduced that we're going to go over. But before we do, I want you to see the word firstborn in verse 1 on page 71. So some translations say firstborn male, but the ESV chose to just keep it firstborn, and that is the closest to the original Hebrew word. That is the closest translation to the actual original Hebrew. So I want you to understand when we see firstborn here that it's not just talking about sons, it's talking about male or female. So hold that in your mind, and let's look at the word consecrate. So I want you to take a pen or a pencil and write above or below verse 2 where you see the word consecrate, because I really want you to understand what this word means, because it's a word that we don't use regularly in Christian community. Consecrate. I would like you to write in there, to declare something sacred, to give over in dedication. And then we're going to write some more in just a few minutes. But I'm going to say that again, to declare something sacred, to give over in dedication. Now that you have that written, keep your finger there and flip over to page 79. We're going to go ahead and start filling in the blanks here. The first word on your fill in there is the word give. If we were going to change this verse into a little bit more modern terms, we'd start with the word give instead of consecrate. Give over to me every firstborn. God is claiming ownership, that's your next fill-in, of the firstborn of everything on earth. I want you to think about what God's desire was here. What does he want us to recognize in consecrating, in giving over to him, and dedicating to him all the firstborn? This is not something that he needs. This is something that he put in place for us. It's for the benefit of us. And I want to talk about why, because that's going to really let you understand these first 16 verses. So God's desire was that the Israelites recognize, and these are your next fill-ins, his right to the ownership of the first and the best. This is on page 79. We're back over there again. God's desire was that the Israelites recognize his right to ownership of the first and the best. And why is this? We're going to see in further laws, like when we get into the rest of the Pentateuch, we are going to see in the laws that war, spoil, harvest, firstborn, God demands all of these firsts. It isn't because he needs anything from us, but when we our giving in obedience from our first fruits. So I want you to think about what that means now. That means child dedication when your child is born. That means the first fruits of your income, 10% of your income, your tithe, your first fruits, the first of everything. If you have a garden, the first of your garden, all these things dedicated to God. When we're giving in obedience from our first fruits, it creates in us a spiritual attitude of submission. And that's what I want you to write in your notes above or below verse 2 on page 71. We know what consecration is. It means that it is declaring something sacred and then giving it over in dedication. So what does this do in us though? Because it's, like I said before, it's not what we're doing for God. God doesn't need your first fruits. God doesn't need your money. All the money in the world is already His. All of the animals on earth are already His. He created them. But what this does is it changes the spiritual attitude in us to submission. Without the attitude of submission, we say, why is this so important that I have an attitude of submission? Without this attitude of submission, which starts by the simple giving back to the Lord, how else can you, down the road in your Christian life, accept salvation? How can you be personally disciplined? How can we stand in humility, stand and be humble without the attitude of submission first? Saying, yes, I believe God is who He is. He's a transcendent and immanent God that sits on the throne of the earth above me. I need to have an attitude of submission to Him by giving back everything that's giving to me. Because if He's sitting on the throne over all the earth, that means your child, your clothes, your food, your money, your husband, everything that you have in your possession, everything that you own, every blessing that's been given to you, the tangible and the intangible, have only come from God, who gives all the good gifts. So, because He gives all the good gifts, the only thing that is reasonable and right for us to do is give our first fruits back to Him. Saying, this is sacred that you gave to me, so I'm going to give this back to you as a first fruit. We do that because it puts us in right attitude. It aligns us with the right spiritual attitude of submission in front of God. Because how can we accept salvation? Because salvation is not just the package of Jesus died on the cross for me, but it's turning our lives and having relationship with Jesus. I can't have relationship with Jesus if I'm not submitted to God. So bringing this firstborn and then consecrating the firstborn, bringing our first fruits, bringing our tithe to God is just a way of us becoming an attitude of submission, submitting to Yahweh, saying He is in charge and everything we have, we're going to give back to Him. So this is not just another law. It is for our personal refinement. It is for our personal discipline to look more like Jesus. Consecrating over what we have is giving our first to Jesus. Remember when we did the Passover meal with Pastor David? And he had all the different layers of the matzah bread. Remember that first bread? That was hidden and put away. That was like the first fruits bread. I want you to think about that, how sacred the first fruits items are. So with that in mind, we're going to look at the next verses. God wants the firstborn and the remembrance of Passover here to remain holy and sacred and set apart. And that's what consecration is. We're setting apart our first fruits for God. And that's what God wants us to do with the remembrance of Passover and with the consecration of the firstborn here in the Bible. Now, I want, if you have questions about the consecration of the firstborn, because it can bring up questions about child sacrifice, and because I don't feel adequate enough to talk to you about all of the historical and cultural events that took place to be able to answer that question for you. If this is a question in your mind, are they doing child sacrifice? This is talking about human sacrifice. I would love for you to go onto the podcast called The Naked Bible and scroll down to like last year, maybe the year before, and look at the Exodus 13 podcast that is listed there. It is a fantastic resource if you want to understand more about what the consecration of the firstborn is. because I'm just giving it to you in simple layman's terms. If you want to go down that rabbit hole, go down it with the Naked Bible. That's an absolutely fantastic resource for you. So I want you to notice the words in verse 3 on page 71. It says, remember this day in which you came out of Egypt. Even though the Exodus has begun now in this chapter, I want you to get a setting in your mind. I want you to set the stage in your mind of what's happening here. Even though the Exodus has begun, they're still in Egypt proper. If you flip over back to your map on page 19 that you probably have labeled and highlighted, they have a long distance to go to get out of Egypt proper and into the Sinai region. Because in the scripture it says here that they're leaving Ramses and Succoth. So that means that they've got a long way to go to Mount Sinai. And if they're thinking that they're going a straight shot to the promised land in Canaan, that's also a long way to go. Since this is like day one of marching out, they're still in Egypt proper. I want you to think about it like Texas. If we were trying to get to Louisiana or Arkansas or Oklahoma, we were trying to get to New Mexico or even Mexico from Houston, if we set out today, we're not getting to any of those places today on foot, even on horseback or on camel. We are going to take a long time to get out of Texas proper before we get to the other place. So I want you to think about them. They're just leaving Exodus. They're just leaving Egypt. They're just beginning the Exodus. This is just the beginning of the start of their journey. They haven't even left yet the land of their slavery. So they're only beginning to take the roads that lead them to their freedom. So you know how Christmas comes only one day a year. We all know it's in December. We all expect it to be cold. We always hope it's going to snow, even though it never does. And we eat cold weather treats that are associated with Christmas because of where it falls on the calendar. If we had Christmas in July, I doubt that we'd be having wassail. We might not be having ham, or think about nutmeg and cinnamon and all the things that we relate to what we eat and the smells because of the cold weather, because of Christmas. When I want you to think about Passover, the Jewish tradition thinks the exact same way of Passover. That's why it's in the spring. It has everything to do with springtime and harvest. Their foods have to do with what's available in the spring. When they think of, like when we think of Christmas and we think of cold and the chicka 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 of reindeer's feet through snow and sleighs and all of that, they have the same idea of this sacred holiday for them, but it just so happens in the spring. So things that are related to where it falls on the calendar in spring are what makes Passover even more special for that time of year for the Jewish tradition. So according to verse 4, what month is Passover in? And it says the word Abib. You'll also see it as A-V-I-V, like Aviv, in other writings, but we're talking about the same month. That word in the Hebrew, if you want to write this in on verse 4 on page 71, that word Abib means ears of grain. And isn't that apropos? They are celebrating Passover when there's ears of grain that you can see out in the field, and that's ready to be harvested. More loosely, that ears of grain would be to us spring, the season of spring. It's the same time of year every year. It's March and April. Later in the Old Testament and going into the New Testament, they're going to refer to this same time of year as Nisan, N-I-S-A-N. So I want you to think about the Israelites, what time of year it is, what's going on. They are supposed to be taking this new feast tradition into the new land of Canaan. The people of the promised land who are already living there, they don't recognize Passover. The Israelites are needing these very clear, specific instructions to know when to have the feast and what to do. So God is laying this out. You're going to have it in this month. You're going to have it for 7 days. You're going to have this feast on the seventh day. You're going to have all these different traditions about the food that you're going to eat, what you're going to remember, what time of day this is going to happen. That's why this is all laid out here. And this is going to make a little bit more sense in just a second. So verses 6 and 7 are really a condensed restatement of what already happened in chapters 12, verse 14 through 20. keep in mind for me, for just a few minutes, bear with me, about the Israelites going to the promised land and needing all of these specific instructions. But I want you to look at verse 8 on page 71 first. Look at verse 8. It says, "You shall tell your son that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt." Why do you think the Israelites were to use first-person statements when telling their children about the Exodus? What would be the reasoning for that? Well, every generation beyond the very first people out of Egypt was going to be a continuum of the experience of the Exodus. I want you to think about that. Every generation. We are part of every generation. Every generation beyond this first generation out of Egypt was going to be a continuum of the experience of the Exodus. The community of faith, even us, at every generation is supposed to identify fully with the original Exodus generation. Think about when you get caught up in a powerful movie or a story. It's the same in God's economy. Each generation of his people is expected to cultivate an identification with all the experiences of all the generations before them. So just as important it was for these people first out of slavery in Egypt, first of the Exodus people, what they're going to tell their children, we should be telling our children. We should be sharing that news because we are part of God's economy, the inheritance of the kingdom. We should be telling it just as enthusiastically and as vibrantly as it was being told as the people that actually lived it. So it's so important that the story of the Exodus is to be actually repeated on the exact day every year, the seventh day of the feast, regardless of the year, regardless of the generation, or if it has been told before. That is why it is so important that the Jewish tradition, the Jewish people, celebrate Passover the exact same time when it's on the calendar in the right month. On the seventh day, they have this feast of the unleavened bread every single year. Every year there is a week-long special focus on the Exodus. That is the Passover and what God did there for his people and how he kept his covenant promises. You guys, this was 3,500 years ago. Give or take a little bit. I'm rounding there. 3,500 years ago. For 3,500 years, people have been celebrating Passover in their homes in the spring every year. I can't imagine any other tradition that we have in our Christian community and our faith that goes further back than this tradition of Passover, than the remembrance of Passover. Because think about Christmas. Yes, we celebrate Christmas in December, and that's probably not when Jesus was born, but that's when we celebrate it. But we've only been celebrating that for about 2,000 years. This goes back another 1,500 years before that for Passover, this sacred, special time of each year. So flip over to page 72 and notice on verse 11 through 13. It starts by saying, when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites. This is what no one realizes. So when God is saying this, when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as swore to you by your fathers, which was from Genesis 3:17 and 15:14. When the Lord brings you out into the land of the Canaanites, no one realizes right now when this is being said to them that is 40 years away, like a really long time. Because this is going to be 40 years from now. Look at verse 11 again. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, that is not going to be till for 40 years. It says, then this is what you should do, okay? You shall set apart for the Lord all of this. So I want you to understand from what I said before, this is so when they have these instructions from when they go into the promised land, they know what time of year, what to do, how to do it, what to eat, all of those things. But because they're going to wander and not get into Canaan for 40 years, these wilderness wandering times are an exception. They're not going to have the ability to do Passover in the right way for 40 years. So God gives these really specific instructions on what they're to do, because they're not going to be doing this and practicing this for 40 years from now. So they need to have a lot of good foundational instructions in place for when they get to that time. So look at verses 11 through 13. And I hope when you were reading this, you saw Jesus in these verses. You were reminded about Jesus. The ultimate purpose of these instructions in verses 11 through 13 was to prepare the Israelites for the death of Jesus on their behalf. His redemption death, his redeeming blood. Flip over to page 79. We're going to do some fill-ins there. If a life is to be restored, it must be bought back. It must be redeemed by a payment. And that payment is often a substitutionary death of something for something else. You guys, this is Jesus. It's exactly what's being laid out here in verses 11 through 13. And it's exactly what Jesus did. First, there was Passover. And it was redemption of something for something else. You're buying back with blood, something for something else. But then Jesus did it the ultimate way. Look at 1 Corinthians 6:20. It says, for you were bought with a price, so glorify God in your body. Then 1 Corinthians 7:23 says, you were bought with a price. Do not become a bondservant of men. So what this is saying is, for a life to be restored, it must be redeemed by a payment. That's what's happening here. Because of Passover, our first fruits, our firstborn, consecrated to God, there was going to be a substitutionary death of something for something else. The New Testament verses we just read followed the logic of the Old Testament redemption system, because it's foreshadowing the redemption price paid by Jesus with his own blood. I don't want you to miss Jesus here. You guys, look at verse 12. You shall set apart to the Lord all the first that opens the womb. Okay? Didn't Jesus first open Mary's womb? Wasn't it Mary's firstborn child? Jesus was the firstborn, consecrated, set apart, used for redemption. I just want you to see that this is pointing to Jesus, because the sacrifice process was a long, arduous, tedious process. It went on and on and on, and it got blurred with a lot of ritual and rite and tradition and legalism. We need Jesus. Jesus came and did the redemption, the redeeming blood once and for all. These verses are pointing to him. They are getting the Israelites in a mindset of what is to come, what they're going to be watching for Jesus. And just like Pastor David had that empty chair, they're still waiting. Jesus came and went 2,000 years ago, and yet the Jews are still waiting. And how much that saddens and grieves our hearts that they're missing out on this incredible Messiah. So verses 14 through 16 are basically Bible words retelling the events. But in your own words, how would you retell this story to your children? How would you say this? Write this down, because look at where it says here. It says that we're going to be retelling this in these first 16 verses. It says that we're going to be retelling this in first person. It shall be a mark on our hands and a frontlet between our eyes, for by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. How would we retell this story to our children? How would you relay what happened in Egypt with the oppression, and then the Pharaoh trying to kill the firstborn sons, and then Moses' call and the plagues, and now the death of the firstborn males and females that of the people that didn't have the blood of the lamb across their doorposts and their lintel? How would you explain and tell your children this exact thing that was going on? I want you to write that out in your own words. I want you to be able to explain this to your kids. So if you have a highlighter or a pen or a pencil, this is what I'd like you to do. On page 72, you're going to draw a line between this last verse of verse 16 and before where it says pillar of cloud and fire. You're going to draw a line. This up here is part 1A, and this down here is part 1B. There was a little blip in the video just now. There were some technical difficulties, and I am coming to you a few hours later. Just don't pay attention to that. The lighting has changed, and now we're in afternoon and not in midday. So you just highlighted here where I told you to, and the top half is part 1A, and the bottom part is part 1B. So some scholars and commentators divide Exodus into two parts like we did, which is bifid. And then some say that the first part of Exodus is where we're ending here in chapter 13, verse 16. And then part 2 starts here with the pillar of cloud and fire. So I just want you to see that we're breaking here from everything from when we started with the oppression down to leaving and the actual Exodus, and now we're picking up with what's happening at the Exodus to get to Mount Sinai. So we've got a little break, oppression to the Exodus, and now the Exodus to Mount Sinai. So as we're moving on, I want you to get in the mindset of the Israelites now that they've exited. Remember, they're still in Egypt proper. They haven't gotten into the Sinai Peninsula yet, but I want you to start getting in their mindset. So here's some questions I want you to consider. I'm going to ask these, and as I'm asking these, I want you to start thinking about the mindset of the Israelites, what they are thinking, how they're feeling, what this is like, moving out of oppression, out of slavery, now into the wilderness following Moses. So, do you think at this time these are a strong-minded, powerful people? Or do you think they identify with being a leaderless victim? Since they've been oppressed for 400 years, would an Israelite know how to take up arms and use weapons in a battle? Since they were very new to direct guidance from Yahweh, because so far they've only been guided by Moses and Aaron. Now they're getting direct guidance from Yahweh through the pillar of cloud and fire. Are they going to understand the power of Yahweh's presence? What do you think some of their assumptions would be about Yahweh? That's what I want you to consider while you're putting on yourself into their shoes, seeing it from their eyes. So it feels easy to point fingers at them when they begin to complain and grumble, but I think it's very possibly would be our exact response in this same situation. So verse 17 starts an entirely new section of Exodus, and that's where your highlighted line is. This is the launch of the rest of our part 1 study. Like I said, we could call it part 1B. From Egypt to Mount Sinai, the process of getting here and the inevitable hardships of the journey. Because from right now where we're studying Exodus to the point they get in Mount Sinai, it's going to be 3 months. That's in 90 days from now. That's like February 3rd, 4th, 5th, somewhere in there is 90 days from now from when I'm making this video. So you can think about how long they're going to be wandering just to get to that fulfillment sign that is worship at the feet of Mount Sinai. So we're going to journey with them through all sorts of events from now that they've left Egypt to the point when they get to Mount Sinai. But in all of it, there's one theme that's going on inside our central theme. So remember, our central and main theme is the God who makes himself known. But now we have this mini theme inside of it, and you can write this on page 9 in your themes if you'd like. And that theme is God at work to bring his people into a right relationship with him. Because how can we make God known if we don't know who he is and we're not in right relationship with him? So that's what the importance is of this theme. We're going to see it over and over again. God at work, bringing the people into him, to right relationship to him. So I want to tell you a story so you can kind of get your mind in the mindset of what's going on here. I'm going to tell you a story about my childhood. So every year, my parents would drive to Michigan with me in tow. I'd be in the back of a 1987 two-tone brown Ford F-150. Remember those old F-150s that the back seat had 2 long slat windows? And I would sit in that back seat. So from our door in the Woodlands, where we lived at the time, to the door of the farm was a 30-hour drive, 60 hours round trip. It's a long time to sit in a back seat. And because my mom and dad would regularly be on a budget, the budget did not include like hotel stays overnight. So we would drive overnight. We would drive door to door. We would only stop for food and for gas. We would not stop for lodging. Every 2 hours, all day and all night for 30 hours, my parents would switch drivers. So 15 times on the way there, 15 times on the way back, every 2 hours, my parents would switch off driving. And I remember very vividly one night, and I was probably, I would say between 7 and 9 years old. My mom would make a pallet in the back of the Ford, and I would be asleep. And I remember waking up and not really knowing where we were. And I remember my dad driving, and it's the dead of night, you know, those 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning hours. And we're driving through Indiana, and there's cornfields on both sides. No signs anywhere about to indicate where you are. And my mom waking up and saying to my dad, "Are you okay, Tim? Are you okay?" And my dad would not really say any words, and he would just say, and that was his sign that everything was okay. He was just tired. So my little mind, my little 7, 8, 9-year-old mind would wonder, how does he know where he's going? It's so dark out there. We haven't passed a sign in ages. Does my dad have a plan? Has he looked at the map? When it gets light again, are we gonna know where we are? Are we gonna be on the right road? Now, as a parent who's driven my own child there and back many, many, many times, I know this. Your parents, your authority, know things you don't know. They see things you don't see. They have plans you're not aware of. So is it, ladies, as Christians, it's remotely possible that you don't know everything that God knows, that you don't see everything that he sees, and that you might not know plans that he has, that he's completely aware of, that you're not aware of. And so on verse 17, as the Israelites are slowly coming out of Egypt, from the very first go, they are on an irregular route they don't know. So if you look at your page 19 map, there's this little checked line that goes from like Egypt, Ramses, Succoth area, and it goes along the coast and it goes up to Canaan, if you want to check that out. That trade route was called the Via Maris, like route by the sea. That was a well-marked trade route. That is going to mean that there's people encamped all along there, that you're by the ocean. There's probably footprints, like a trail that's been carved out over years of people using this trade route. But the Israelites are being directed by God in a different way. They would have chosen this obvious path to go from here straight down the trade route to the promised land. But God, with a broader plan, needed to direct the people another way. So enter the Philistines. And if you did your homework, you read a little bit about the backstory of the Philistines, and some of their history is kind of blurred and hard to find because they are a people group that just faded from the earth. So even though very little remains intact about their history, we know one thing. They were a daunting fighting force. They had a strong army, and they were always ready for battle. They used the sneak attack method when it came to overtaking and conquering other tribes and other people group. If you fast forward to Joshua and you looked at Joshua 13, even at Joshua's death, still no one was able to conquer the Philistines. God knows this. He has this incredible plan to take Israel in another route. Even though the Via Maris is a direct route, it went straight through the Philistine territory. Look at that page 19 map. Where you see along the water there, you'll see something that says like the way to the Philistines, where the Philistines camped out, right there along the edge of the water. So the people who are unarmed and weak and tired and are coming from oppression, they're not ready for battle, cannot be taken through the Philistines. And even further looking into their history, According to Judges and 1 Samuel, the Philistines had their eye on Canaan already. They wanted land expansion that would include Canaan. So there is no way they were going to let this people group of Israel get past them to get to the land that they ultimately want. So look at the end of verse 17. It says, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. God, in his constant compassion for us, shows his concern for the unpreparedness of the Israelites to fight anybody else. But moreover, look back on page 22, verse 12. So flip back there. Page 22, verse 12, on that page says, and he said, but I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you, and I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. So God doesn't take them down that Via Maris just because there's Philistines there, because he can move supernaturally. He needs to take them another route because his word cannot return void. He says way back in 3:12, when you leave Egypt, you will serve me here at Mount Sinai. Look at Mount Sinai on your page 19 map. That's way down at the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula. They can't go up here to Canaan. They need to go down to the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula to Mount Sinai and worship God there for God's word to be fulfilled. So they need to go back to Mount Sinai. That is a little clue there in verse 17, back on page 72, that foreshadows the Red Sea. Moses is preparing you, the reader, that in the event that the Israelites are cornered, they're going to need divine intervention to succeed. Because God says there, the people will change their minds when they see war, they see they're being cornered, they see an obstacle, and they're going to want to run back to Egypt. And that's exactly what they're about to say to Moses here in just a little bit when they get cornered at the Red Sea. Because if they saw what was ahead, they would instantly run back to slavery because it's all they know. And I want you to think about that in your life, because sometimes God is calling us into obedience and he's calling us into uncharted territory. I know that when God called me to teach the Bible a few years ago, and I was on my very first step of let's go get Bible teacher message writing training in North Carolina. If God had told me the obstacles, the physical and mental hardships that I was about to encounter, things that have happened with our finances, our moving in a house, things that have happened with our adult child, if he had told me that was what was ahead and I knew the full plan, there is no way I would have moved forward. I would have thought, oh no, right here is more comfortable. And I would have missed out on the promised land blessings that I'm currently experiencing in my life. So that's why God just gives them a glimpse, because if we knew what was going to stand in front of us, we would always run back to that comfortable place every single time. So thinking back about the story I told about driving to Michigan, when I questioned my parents, and I know for a fact when Laurel questioned me on those 60-hour drives, that I think to myself, and I know my parents were thinking, this is so simple, why don't you trust me? I want you to think about that for whatever God is calling of you right now. In his mind, because he is at the beginning of creation right now, as much as he is at the end of this earth, and he's at all of our time and our linear time and dimension right now. He's at all those places at once. He sees the whole picture and he thinks, this is so simple. Why don't you just trust me? I want you to be assured that if he's calling you to something right now, his presence is on you. Take the first step. If you saw the whole plan, and I know for some of us and some of our personalities, when we don't see the whole plan, it looks daunting and scary. But to God, seeing the whole plan already, he's just asking you to take the first step. Then he's going to show you what the second step is. So friend, right now, if you are worried or nervous or have anxiety about what God's calling you to do in obedience, I'm asking you, take the first step. It's so simple. Just trust him. how much more does our God, with good plans and purposes we know nothing about, care about us and have a specific plan for each one of us? Remember, he's a transcendent and immanent God. He actually cares about every single part of you and what you're doing in your day to day. So I want you to consider this. With all the pain and the suffering that our world is going through right now, we're sitting here through one of the most divisive and chaotic elections that we have ever had in American history. Just in the last few months since COVID started in March, we've had pain, we've had suffering, we've had gender confusion, racism, human trafficking, injustice, riots, fear, disease, viruses, divisiveness, cancel culture, lack of grace, for all of that you see right now that's been happening this year. We don't even have a tiny glimpse of what God sees. Yet God, he is so merciful to us while our view is so limited, because I can't see past today. I can't see past this hour or when I was recording this video 4 hours ago, I thought I'd be able to record all the way through, but because my view is so limited, I didn't know technical issues were just coming. I can only see so far, just this minute, just this moment. And so God provides encouragement for our journey, and he provided it to the Israelites. You guys, I do not want you to miss this point, because I want you to find the bones on your journey, and I'm going to explain what that means. If you look at verse 19, it says, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here. Turn to Genesis 50:22 through 26. The significance of what these bones meant. Listen to this. Genesis 50:22 through 26. So Joseph, this is 430 years ago, remained in Egypt. He and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children also of Machir, the sons of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to Sorry, we just had another technical blip. And Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you here in Egypt. You shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died being 110. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Even Joseph said, God's going to visit you here. And when God visits you here, you're going to take my bones, because I'm not an Egyptian. I was sold into slavery to become an Egyptian, because I am the Hebrew Israelite son of Jacob, son of Israel. And God, we knew that when God was going to visit Egypt, that there would be a sign that those bones would be removed and walked out with the Israelite people. This is encouragement when our view is so limited about the journey forward. This was God's encouragement. They could see it with their eyes. It was encouraging that the right things were happening. God said through Joseph that the bones would leave here when they left Egypt, when God visited them, and here they are following the bones out of Egypt. The bones alone are a powerful reminder of God's never failing fidelity to his never forgotten covenant. They could actually physically see this promise. Wouldn't they believe it because this one they could see? I want you to start thinking about the things that God has shown you along the way that are those signs that you are headed in the right direction, that he is there and you are moving forward. So look at verse 21. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. They had the pillar of cloud and fire, cloud by day, fire not by night. If the bones weren't enough physically that you could see and touch, that the right things were happening, God in his mercy and compassion came manifested his own self, his own presence as cloud and fire. It was in their view 24 hours a day. Through the long, hot days and the cold, quiet, desolate nights, would you have any doubt about your exit and God's long-term exodus plan when you can see him right in front of you? After all, the pillar went ahead of them and represented God's leadership as they moved through unknown territory. But let's think about what they couldn't see. Because we think, oh, if God just showed up and he just directed me, everything would be okay. But would it? Because what about the things that you can't see? That's the things that you start to dislike. I know after 2 hours, I'd be like, so are we going some specific way? I wonder why we're not moving. Because if you've traveled with me anywhere, you know I'm an itinerary kind of girl. I like to know where we're going and when we're supposed to be there, and when we're supposed to leave there, and where we're going to go after that. And I am an itinerary person. So if we weren't moving in the direction that I thought we should on a trade route that I thought that was the most obvious way, or towards water or towards food, I would start to question. Because it's just like us in our frailty that our basic needs and our instincts kick in, and we start distrusting. We start questioning. So even though you think about how great it is to just easily follow the cloud and never have to worry about your life again, how do you think it would feel if you didn't know where you were going to move? You didn't know what was coming next. You couldn't see all the things that God was doing for you behind the scenes. You didn't have a map. You didn't have an itinerary. They just operated with the usual assumptions of most people trying to understand the workings of God. Most of us think this: a good, powerful God would hardly allow his people to go through troubles and dangers and griefs and testings, right? I mean, if God is all powerful and he can oppress the Egyptians through the plagues while sparing his own people, we can now expect him to take care of all of our wants and desires just as we define them, can't we? But that's not the way God is, because this is about making him known, not about our own personal comforts. He sometimes brings us through hardships, brings us through oppression, so that he can be made known, so that his glory will be on display. Because there is all sorts of physical evidence in front of us, you and me, every day. Just like the Israelites had the bones and the pillar of cloud and fire. What are the physical evidences that you have in your life that God has been on this journey? He's been providing. He knows the way. Jobs, marriages, children, finances, maybe the home you live in, different things God has promised to you along the way. You're sitting there with the physical evidence. But we still sit around and we question every little thing. So don't look down on the Israelites for their grumbling, because we would be grumbling every inch of the way as well. So before we are going into the journey with the Israelites from Egypt to Sinai, before we go into chapter 14, there's some specific things I want you to start watching for, because it's the way that we act over and over and over again, and it's the same God the Israelites serve that we serve today. I want you to think how much what's happening with the Israelites right now parallel with us, because I want you to be in the mindset of the Israelites so that you can be understanding of their plight and understand how desperate we are in need of God. So think about these points. God at work to bring his people into right relationship with him. Well, that was happening just as much as it was with the Israelites as it has happening just as we are right now, just as much as today. God at work to teach his people dependence on provision for them. Happening with the Israelites, valid and relative in our lives today. God allowing people to learn how to trust him in all sorts of difficult situations, even when we start choosing the hard way. Totally happened to the Israelites, happening right now for us today. And lastly, God always treating us in a way that we still find really hard to accept. He doesn't tell us everything we want to know. He only shares what we need to know in order for us to become his covenant people and receive his salvation. And I want you to think back on John, if you studied John, or if you know about John. During Jesus' ministry, before Passover came and before he was going on the last few hours of his life before crucifixion, all of that ministry time, the disciples questioned him. Sadducees, Pharisees, other people constantly questioning him. If Jesus told them what they wanted to know and not what just they needed to know, the disciples alone would have done everything that they could have to seize Jesus and not let him go to the cross. They'd have done everything they could to get in the way of the plan because they thought they knew a better way. They thought they were protecting the Savior. They thought they were protecting Jesus. But in essence, they were just getting in his way. Because we don't need to know what's going on. We just need to know what God allows us to know. Because that's the only way we can become his covenant people. That's the only way we can receive salvation, is by just trusting, just following what he's asking us to follow. So there are some themes that we're going to see in the next few chapters, and it's going to start right here, right now with the Israelites. So remember when I was talking about the walk to Via Maris from Egypt to Canaan? It had a very clear path, and it took 2 weeks. How long did it take the Israelites to get to Canaan? 40 years. But God took them his own way on a longer path because of his mercy on them. Not because he wanted to punish them or they were doing something wrong, but it was for the good of his own people. Because I want you to think about the counterfactuals in life that never happened. The factuals, the facts, are the things that did happen. I own a fence company, and I got married to Brandon, and I have my daughter Laurel. What if I had had an abortion? What if I had had a miscarriage? What if Laurel had died at a little age? What if Brandon and I had gotten divorced? What if we had never gotten married? What if he remained a chef and we hadn't started a fence company? All of the counterfactuals that are the opposite of the facts in your life. We don't think of the 10,000 things God does for us in his mercy by never doing to us. Does that make sense to you? We don't think about the 10,000 things God does for us in his mercy by never doing to us. The divine nevers we are blissfully unaware of. Our testimony isn't just that what we've been through, but all the messes and destruction and the paths that he kept us from. His constant grace, his constant provision, his mercy, the steering of our lives, and yet we complain. We doubt, we groan, and we become impatient. Because the Israelites' counterfactuals are they didn't go down the Via Maris and go straight into the arms of the Philistines. They went down and worshiped God at Mount Sinai, where they received the law. They received the plans for the tabernacle. Their lives were blessed and abundant. The counterfactuals of our lives, I want you to think what the counterfactuals are of your life. So here we catch up to the Israelites, and they're headed down this clear path. And then in verse 2 of chapter 14, God begins leading them in a direction that isn't what they think is right. Tell the people to turn back. And I think they would say, wait, what now? Tell us to turn back? You don't have to be an expert to know this is a terrible idea to the Israelites. Why are they turned around? Why are they now between a rock and a hard place? God has set them up between the desert and the sea, and they are trapped. Have you ever felt trapped like that in your Christian walk? Or felt trapped in your own doing? Or felt trapped in being obedient? But what God was doing was creating a trap for Pharaoh, who wasn't even pursuing the Israelites yet. Think about this. God was positioning the people to trap Pharaoh, and by this time, Pharaoh is not even pursuing them yet. God was positioning the people for mercy, grace, and protection before they needed it, before Pharaoh readied one chariot for his terrible warpath of wrath. God knew. He positions, he places, he leads, he changes things, he guides, he changes the course, he stops us, he starts us, he slows us because he knows. But we always have this stubborn little plan that we try to stick to. But God always has a big, gracious plan. So let's go back. What is the theme of Exodus? It's the God who makes himself known. The God who makes himself known even to Pharaoh. He's positioning his people. And at the same time, he's hardening Pharaoh's heart again. The climax is coming because no matter what, God will be made known. So look at verse 4 on page 73. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, and the Egyptians shall know I am Yahweh. God will get glory over Pharaoh and all of his army, and all of Egypt shall know I am Yahweh. So put your historical and your cultural glasses back on and see yourself as an Israelite. Your back is to the sea. Turning back means going back to Egypt. The desert is on your side. Pharaoh and his chariots are barreling down on you. Yet the theme of God's superiority over Pharaoh that we've seen over and over and over again continues even here. When you're in a rock and a hard place, God has a big and gracious plan, as he always does. His purpose is to gain the final glory over Pharaoh as well as his armies. And so Pharaoh gathers his chariots and pursues the Israelites because he's going to bring them back to slavery. So look at page 74, verses 10 through 12. The Israelites do what they do best. They begin to panic and complain. Read with me, starting verse 10 through 12. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to Yahweh. They said to Moses, "It is because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness. What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than die in the wilderness." Is this what we do best when we are stressed out and scared? It's a familiar pattern of complaints. This is how they come out of my mouth and my heart every time. And I've heard the same come out of yours when you're in a pinch. I have actually heard some of you watching this video out of your very own mouth do these 4 things that we do over and over again. We cannot read verses 10 through 12 in shock and disbelief because it's exactly what we do. This is how we do it. The look back. The look back. Where I was before wasn't so bad. I mean, even though I thought it was when I was there, it was really a comfortable place, and I know it and it's familiar. It really wasn't that bad. I really could be fine back where I was. And then we do the look at God. He never really cared about me. I mean, he forgot about me in this whole situation. He's forsaken me. This is way out of his league now. This is way too big for him. And then we restate our unbelief. We say, "God, didn't I tell you this wasn't going to work? Here I am being obedient, but it's the same old story. Whose fault is this anyway?" And then if there was a spouse or a relative or a family member or a friend or a government authority or whatever that got you to the place that you're at, you turn on them because they need blame. What you do in Moses? "Oh, great decision, husband of mine. If I had a different president, if I had a different boss, if I had better friends, if I had parents that gave better advice, if I was paid more," and the list goes on and on. And so before we get to verses 13 and 14 with the answer to this panic and complaining, the big question is, are you compliant but still complaining? Because that's not where God calls us to be. Thinking what we know is best, forgetting what God has done, is not where he calls us to be. Get out your highlighters and let's go to verse 13 and 14, because this is the answer to what we start questioning and complaining, and we're cornered and we don't know what's coming. Look at verse 13 with me on page 74. "And Moses said to the people, 'Fear not, stand firm, see the salvation of Yahweh, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. Yahweh will fight for you, and you only have to be silent.'" So get out those highlighters and highlight, "Fear not, stand firm, see, and be silent." Then flip over to page 79. This is God's response to when we fear and we doubt and we start to complain. This is what he says, ladies, we can hold on to these 4 directives. You'll see I have little blanks there. I'm just going to start telling you, and you make notes to whatever God is speaking to you about each of these things as I tell you what they are. Fear not. This should sound familiar because in Genesis 15:1 and 26:24 and in 46:3, God says it to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the Israelites are in good company right here. They're in the company of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because God also told them, fear not. Now the entire Israel nation is hearing the same thing. There is nothing to fear except the Lord. And I want you to look at Ephesians 6:10-17. Because this is why we get to fear not. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. Stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith, which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one. And it goes on to talk about the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, praying at all times in the Spirit. Keep alert with all perseverance. We know that because we have the full armor of God, we can fear not. The victory has already been won. That armor is impenetrable because it's supernatural. God has gone out before us, so fear not and stand firm. Standing firm is the hardest thing to do out of these. That's being patient and being still. We don't like to stand still. I hate standing still. But Charles Spurgeon says this so well. I could have never said it as good as he does. He says, I dare say you will think it's a very easy thing to stand still, but it is one of the postures which a Christian soldier learns, not without years of teaching. I find that marching and quick marching are much easier to God's warriors than just standing still. It is perhaps the first thing we learn in the drill of human armies, but it is the most difficult to learn under Jesus Christ, the captain of our salvation. The apostle seems to hint at this difficult when he says, stand fast, and having done all, still stand. To stand at ease in the midst of tribulation shows a veteran spirit with long experience and much divine grace. So when you're fearing not, stand firm and then see. If you're seeing the Egyptians barreling down on you, it's a good thing because it means God's work is about to be accomplished. His salvation is at hand. You see the salvation you have been waiting for, and when you see it, be silent. This doesn't mean don't speak out. Speak only the words of Christ. Speak against injustice. This means that your spirit is completely quiet. Your spirit is silent. When your spirit is quiet, your mind is quiet, and God's words can be saturated into you and can be discerned. God is asking the Israelites to do nothing and let him do everything. So look at your final fill in there. We look back and we thank God for not answering the prayers the way we prayed them. His way is always better. Looking back, we trace his hand, but looking forward, we follow his heart. And right here is where many of us are really living our lives right now today. We're between the Pharaoh and the sea and the desert on a path we don't remember getting on, and we're waiting for direction, or we're waiting for a new path. We're waiting for something that's better. And here we are with the Israelites at the edge of the greatest story of divine deliverance in the Old Testament. This is the last place in Exodus where the Egyptians and the Israelites have direct contact, the final glory of God over Pharaoh. Everything from chapter 1, or we started Exodus 1:1, is now coming down to these moments of sovereign exodus. Kevin DeYoung says it so well. As long as there is a Bible and people who follow the God of the Bible, which is to say forever and ever, people will be talking about the crossing of the Red Sea. Poems will be written, sermons will be preached, movies upon movies will be made. It was perhaps the most famous event in the history of Israel. Can you think of an event that is more divine, more supernatural, more deliverance and salvation before Jesus on that side of the cross than the crossing of the Red Sea? For Israel, the crossing of the Red Sea is much like the Civil War is for us here in America. You can't understand our history apart from it. In fact, you cannot understand our Christian history apart from the Red Sea. For the crossing of the Red Sea became the central act on that side of the cross of God's redemptive history to save his people. It's the event that the Israelites kept telling themselves over and over and over again, and that God would remind his people of over and over and over again when they forget his great power and care for them. The Israelites assume they are hopeless and trapped. Where are they going to go? They cannot outrun chariots on foot. They can't walk into the sea, or can they? Because isn't God the creator of all things? How easy was it for him to control the wind and the water and the ground during the plagues? This shouldn't be any surprise to the Israelites or to you. Haven't they all experienced God's power over nature during the plagues? And that is the way God is, outside of our realm of experience or knowledge. But we box him in, and we put the answers we're seeking outside the realm of concept. We think that's impossible. There's no way he could part the sea. But back in verse 10, the Israelites were afraid and they called out, and God responded to them in verse 15, and he says, "Why are you crying out to me? Move." So look at page 74 again, and look at verse 16. What is the physical object we see again here? That staff. And what is it continually representing? God's power, God's presence, God's ability to do the supernatural. The same staff that turned the Nile to blood and then made the frogs come out of that same water will now command the entire Red Sea through the power of God and cause it to divide in a direction that they thought was so beyond the limit of their possibility. God has made possible. Not just ground, but dry ground. Ground so dry and so safe that you wouldn't hesitate to take your kids across it. So dry that Pharaoh's chariots figured they could drive across it too. Not muddy, not dangerous, not quicksand, completely dry ground. The sea opens up and the pillar of cloud moves between the Egyptians and the Israelites to give the Israelite people a head start to get across the sea and to hold the armies back. And did you notice that the pillar isn't just a guide for the people, but now it's a protector? Are those two things equally important? God is the provider and God is the protector. But the next question is, and this is going to be contrary to the Moses movie, how long did that pillar of cloud hold that place and hold the people back? Because the Israelites are numbering into the thousands upon thousands, and they need to pack up and break camp and form ranks and get organized and cross the Red Sea. Since verse 20 discusses on page 74, it discusses the night, the pillar of fire, we can assume that all night they crossed. Look at verse 21. All night they crossed, and the pillar held them back and held back Pharaoh's pursuit. What did that strong east wind do back in chapter 10, verse 13? It brought the locusts. And historically speaking, that east wind in Egypt is still today considered the punishing, destructive wind because it's blistering hot and dry. And we know this wasn't some natural occurrence where the sea became low or there was a drought and they were able to cross because of one word in verse 22, showing that this is a supernatural event. It's the word wall, and it's the Hebrew homah, meaning a very large wall, not just a small structure, a wall of water that towers over the people. The Egyptians pursue the Israelites into that parted sea, and not only does God bind up their wheels, but makes them disoriented and they try to flee. What is the key word in verse 25 that shows the Egyptians acknowledge the true identity of the Israelites' God? It says, for Yahweh fights for them. Because what is the theme of Exodus? God will make himself known. God's purpose of revealing himself to Egypt is now fully accomplished. I am Yahweh could now truly be understood. What Moses promised to the people, Yahweh will fight for you, will now be apparent even to the enemy. Again, the mighty staff is stretched out. It's over the water from the other side, and the waters crash down on the Egyptians. God, the miraculous creator of the sea obeys him. The rocks, the mountains, the trees, the grass obey him. Whatever speculation Moses and the Israelites had about their deliverance, their enemy had drowned before their eyes at daybreak. Do you think in their wildest dreams this would have been their deliverance? And I can count on both hands, and then over and over and over again, the times that God's deliverance, the time that God moves for me, has been way different than I ever thought it would be. He moves in a different way than I even thought was possible, way outside of my realm of concept. God assured his people of total elimination of the enemy, and then has not changed for us. And what were those 4 things he asks of us while we wait for his defense? Fear not, stand firm, see and be silent. If there was ever a tattoo to get, that would be the one. Remember, it is so much better his way. And look at the words in verse 27, morning appeared. The Israelites could see this whole process clearly. The Israelites were fully across, and the Egyptians were fully in the sea. And from the darkest of nights, morning appeared. And these last verses, 29 through 31, sum up the great miracle of deliverance at the sea. Hemmed in on all sides, and Yahweh made a way, because he always does. The otherwise unbeatable foes now were slowly washing onto the shore. Here we are again with God differentiating his people from the Egyptians. His people stand alive in victory. The Egyptians lay dead. Look back at Exodus 6:1. Every single thing God said was going to happen has now happened. Our God is a God who makes distinctions. It's unpopular to think that, but it is absolutely biblical and theologically sound. Not one Israelite is lost, but not an Egyptian is spared. And I hope you understand this, ladies, that it will be so the same when Christ returns. Because just as the creed said, the Apostles' Creed, to judge the living and the dead, God made distinction with his people from his covenant in Genesis, and he will make distinctions for his people right now, because we're set apart as the kingdom economy, as his divine inheritors of his kingdom. And he's going to make distinctions on the throne room at the end of time after the rapture, when we stand before the judgment throne. He's going to judge the quick, then the living, and the dead. God is a God of distinction. Not one who belongs to Christ will be lost in the end, and not one apart from Christ will be saved. The Egyptians were swallowed up into the sea. God makes a distinction between his people and his enemies right there at the shores of the Red Sea. And that is absolute biblical rock solid theology. God is a God who makes distinctions. Don't think he cannot distinguish you, a believer, from an unbeliever. He knows you because you are set apart. You are his chosen, elect people. So now the Israelites are able to freely move across the wilderness without the pursuit of slavery in Egypt anymore. It's over. But 31, that verse, has the resultant faith. And this is the most important implication of all the events in Exodus so far, the resultant faith of God's people in Yahweh and their willingness to help, to place their trust in him and Moses. Do you see how 31 points to Jesus? It says they believed in Yahweh because faith saves. For the Israelites and for you and for me, faith saves. Their fear of God was prompted, which engaged their trust and resulted in faith in Yahweh. The Lord can always be trusted to deliver his people no matter what the circumstance. From this lesson here, I want you to take away that his way is better. So in closing, this is what I ask of you. Close the door to the room you're in. Turn lights off if you need to. Get quiet and get still. I want you to follow the link down below. And I want you for the next 12 minutes to worship at the feet of Jesus. This fantastic song called Defender, and this one is being sung by Jesus Culture, is a reminder to you that God is your defender and at your defense. But all you have to do is worship and bow down and stand firm and stay still and stay quiet and see his deliverance at hand. So as you turn off my video here and you click on the link below, I want you to start putting your mind into the mindset of what you're facing right now. The hardship that you're in, waiting for God's deliverance, waiting for his defense. And will you worship with me? Know that I love you and know that you are prayed for, and know that the many, many times that I stood or bowed or sat in my office listening to this song, worshiping, all I could think was each of you. I saw each one of your faces, and I was so pleased to offer my worship and intercess for you on your behalf to God. Friend, please worship with me right now. I love you, and I'll see you next week.